So we recently got our first look into Season 3 of Diablo 4, and I was kind of right, kind of wrong about there being runes within the season. There is runes in this season, but they work in a completely different way than I thought there would. So I want to go over the big bullet points of what we're going to be getting in Season 3 with all the new mechanics, all the new quality of life, all the new content, and then in the upcoming days I'll be doing videos going much more in depth with all these different systems. Now this season has a mechanical theme, which I think is really nice because it's something completely different from what we've gotten in Season 1 and Season 2, and we're also getting our first new monster family added into Diablo 4 with the constructs, which are going to be a full mechanical monster family. So it's not going to just be recolors of other monsters we got at the base game. They're all going to be completely different, new monsters, new enemies, all looking very unique, and they're probably going to have a lot of new abilities that are much more unique to fight against. Now the overarching story of the season is that under the Sands of Kyrgyzstan, there is something called a loom, which is this ancient technology designed by Zoltan Kulle that has now been taken over by a demon called Malphus, and he's twisted the loom and all these constructs to his will, so they'll now be defending all the demons instead of fighting against them to keep them out of the loom and out of these mechanical vaults. So we're going to venture down under the Sands of Kyrgyzstan to a new town center called Gate Hall, which is going to be our base of operations, and that's where we're going to start our fight against all of these new demon-controlled constructs. And Malphus is also going to be the new boss fight for this season. Now, the new power system of this season is going to be Diablo 4's first companion called a Seneschal, which is basically this little robotic spider construct that we plop a rune on top of so we can control it and give it different abilities and augments. Now, these little construct spiders are going to have two different types of stones we get to put in it to give it new abilities or augment its abilities. And these are governing and tuning stones. Now, governing stones are going to be abilities we teach our companion. And there's going to be two governing slots. So two different abilities you can teach your construct. Then you're going to have tuning stones, which augment those two different abilities. And there's going to be 3 tuning stone slots for each one of your governing stone. So 2 different abilities and 3 slots for each of those abilities to augment them. And there's going to be 12 total governing stones, so 12 different abilities, and 27 different tuning stones, which you can use in combination with any other tuning stones or any other governing stones. So there's actually going to be quite a lot of different options and combinations you can have here. And it's not just going to be different attacks you give your companion. Some of these governing stones will also just be straight up like support abilities that you can augment to help you even more. So for instance, for a governing stone, which is an ability, you have auto defense. The Seneschal construct activates an anti-material field around itself, shooting down enemy projectiles. Cannot shoot down boss or player projectiles. So this is going to be a super supportive ability for you. If you're, say, maybe a ranged character and you're more squishy, you might want this because now your companion can just put up this field and it rejects all enemy projectiles, basically allowing you to immune a bunch of different projectiles. But then we have something like Gyrate. The Seneschal construct whirls its legs around quickly, dealing damage to all surrounding enemies. So you basically give your little companion a whirlwind or a blade storm. And there's going to be a bunch of different stuff, and these are just the base abilities. But then we have the tuning stones, which remember, you can have 3 tuning stones augmenting one of the governing stones or one of the abilities. And you have some basic stuff like, do you increase that skill's effect size? So if you took Gyrate, now that whirlwind is going to be a much larger radius. Or you have some other things like Frigid Support. A portion of the supporter skill's damage dealt is applied as cold damage over time and applies chill. So now you're able to apply all these different elemental damage types, which may completely change up a build. I know I've seen the example where one of these tuning stones can apply a fire damage dot. If you're a sorceress, you can now take all the passive effects in your skill tree that work off of an enemy having a fire damage dot on them, which would allow you to use a different enhancement for your enhancement slots. So there's going to be a lot of different options with these, and they did give a list of almost all of these, but there are 2 different tuning stones that they hid from us that seem like they may be much more rare and much more substantial. There's one called Evernight and there's one called Genesis. So it does seem like there's going to be some super rare, super strong tuning stones as well. Now you'll also be able to level up these stones to increase their power. So you'll have to either find or craft duplicates of the stones you're using. You fuse them together, which grants them experience to level them up, and you'll be able to get some pretty significant buffs while leveling up specifically tuning stones, because you'll even be able to do things like like add additional projectiles or even change the damage type they perform. So leveling up these stones is going to be a big part of the progression for the season, kind of like getting all the different blood for season 2 to level up your vampiric powers. This seems a little bit more substantial than vampiric powers, and it does seem like there are actually going to be a lot more options. And I really like vampiric powers, so if there's actually going to be a lot more options and more progression with this system, I do think that's overall going to be a win and something even a bit better than the vampiric powers of season 2. Now, the new main content system of the season are dungeon vaults. So these are basically going to be specialized dungeons that house elemental hazards devised by Zoltan Kulle that are now taken over by the demons. And these are going to be filled with all these new construct enemies, and there's going to be all these different traps and hazards you have to try to avoid. But these aren't just going to be normal dungeons. They actually seem pretty unique and quite interesting because of how different resources of this season are going to play into these vault runs. So upon entering the vault, you have to convert these pearls of warding, which is a new resource we'll go over, and you convert those into a new blessing called Zoltan's Warding. And this is going to be a blessing that allows you to access the riches or loot within these vaults. Now, this warding blessing you get will actually diminish stacks if you fall prey to all the hazards throughout the vaults. We don't know how this is going to work. It sounds like maybe taking too much damage or getting hit by the different traps or hazards within these vaults will reduce the amount of stacks of this blessing you have. But then if you manage to keep the warding intact after defeating the vault boss at the end, you'll unlock a ward woven chest, which has a higher chance of granting legendary items. And these chests will also give you a higher chance to get the different stones that you'll put in your companion. But then you can also use more pearls of warding, which give you the blessing, which will increase the risk of your vault run by giving you more stacks of this blessing. And obviously, if you get to the end, defeat the boss with more stacks, you'll get an even bigger reward. So this sounds like a kind of simple way of basically juicing a vault run, kind of like in PoE how you can juice maps. It sounds like a bit more of a simple way of doing that. But then in World Tier 3, you'll also be able to get Nightmare Vaults, and Vault Sigils will drop alongside typical Nightmare Dungeon Sigils, or they could be crafted with Pearls of Warding. So once you get into the end game, you'll also have Nightmare Vaults that'll obviously just be harder, give you better loot, and will be more difficult. And depending how this system is done, it could actually be a very good system for the game. In PoE, they've had maps forever where you can put a bunch of resources into a map to try to get a bunch more resources out of the map. And that's kind of what they're doing here. But like I mentioned, a little bit of a more simple fashion, but that can add a massive amount of replayability, and it can actually add some stakes into your runs. Because if you spend a ton of these pearls of warding, spend all of your pearls of warding, and then you have a bad run, you just wasted a ton of pearls without getting a ton of loot at the end. But you can juice up, use a ridiculous amount of pearls, have a perfect run, get to the end, and just get showered with a ridiculous amount of loot. And that risk and reward, when done right, can add some pretty interesting content into the game. Now, these pearls of warding are obviously going to be pretty important in this season, and there's actually another open world system that's going to allow you to farm them. And these are called Arcane Tremors. So Malphas seeks to unleash deadly constructs upon Sanctuary, pouring from the underground vault to terrorize the innocents and sinful alike. Dismantle deadly traps, destroy lesser and elite constructs to earn Shattered Stone. Dispatching elite constructs also grants Pearls of Warding, which can be used to earn highly valuable rewards from replaying vaults. Negate the Arcane Tremor by defeating the vault's mighty Herald construct, securing a piece for the denizens above. So this sounds like it's going to be another open world event, but with it being described in this and some other interviews, it sounds like it's not going to be timed open world event like how Blood Harvests were or how Helltides are. It sounds like it's going to be more of random world events that you would find scattered across all of the different maps of the open world. Now, I, for one, really enjoyed Blood Harvest from Season 2. I think a lot of people did. So hopefully this is another open world piece of content that takes a lot of the learnings from Blood Harvest. Hopefully these Arcane Tremors are actually enjoyable just to play in instead of being something you feel like you have to do that you don't like to get these resources, because that's what Blood Harvest was. It was really enjoyable enjoyable to go do. Crazy mob density, it's super good loot drops. You could stay in there for hours and never feel like you're taking a break from just destroying groups of enemies. Hopefully Arcane Tremors are in a similar way an enjoyable piece of content, because it's seeming like this is going to be the main way you're farming up Pearls of Warding, which seem like are going to be a very important resource. Now, the last piece of content we have actually gotten information on is obviously the Gauntlet, which is what's coming along with leaderboards. There's going to be leaderboards, there's going to be the Gauntlet, which is a new static dungeon that you fight through to get weekly leaderboard rankings. Now, this is not going to be coming out at the start of the season. This is probably the main very negative thing I've seen about the information for season 3 we've gotten. One of the main reasons being having this new leaderboard system not being at the launch of the season basically just means that season 3 leaderboards aren't going to matter a ton, because everybody's already probably going to be full build. Everybody's going to know what's completely meta. Everybody's probably going to be rushing to do grouped up Duriel runs to try to get all the uber uniques they can, and it's basically going to be all of the same build with all of the uber uniques getting the top spots every single week for the entirety of season 3. Now, personally for me, I don't really care about leaderboards that much, so this doesn't heavily affect me, but I know a lot of people who really care about leaderboards, who really like leaderboards in other ARPGs. This is going to be something very negative about this season, that the Gauntlet is going to be added sometime later within the season. Now, we don't have full patch notes. That's going to be coming in a few days, but we actually got to look at some new quality of life features, which are actually as or more exciting than the actual new content we're getting. First off, Hell Tides Endure, and this is something we've already known about, but Hell Tides are basically always going to be active. After a Hell Tide ends, there's just going to be a 5-minute rest, then a new one's going to pop up. And in some interviews, they did also say there's going to be higher density of enemies in Hell Tides. So Hell Tides, I think, are going to be a much more enjoyable piece of content. They're also going to allow you to get a lot more resources to farm Duriel a lot more. So overall, these Hell Tide changes are probably going to be one of the most significant changes with this season. Then we got something that was actually very surprising. We're getting WASD movements for PC. So now you have the option of moving on clicks like we've been playing Diablo 4, or you can now use WASD and move around in a more modern way. Now, I'm not actually sure how good WASD movement is going to feel. Blizzard games usually all feel really good to play anyway, but this is actually a really interesting addition, because the last we've heard of WASD movement is that it was on the developer's radar, but it's not something that we're actively looking into. So them getting WASD movement into season 3 tells me that they're probably pretty far into development with a lot of the quality of life and big overhauls they've been working on, like itemization overhauls, changing all the legendary aspects to add them into the codec instead of having to store them in your stash. This is probably a good sign for a lot of the big overhauls and quality of life stuff coming to the game. We're also going to be getting an additional stash tab, which is going to be very welcomed, and this is actually going to mean a lot more once they do the overhaul to the aspect system, where all of your aspects are going to go in your codec. You're not going to have to store them as items anymore. So an extra stash tab with not having to store aspects anymore is actually going to be pretty massive. We're actually going to have a decent amount of stash space. Then the last thing they showed off is a respec mode, which will allow you to basically put in all of your points of your skill tree in a preview mode. Then you'll just be able to apply them all at once. So instead of going in and trying different stuff out and instantly using the gold and then having to take it out, use more resources, you're now just able to go in a preview mode, put in all of your points, and then buy it all at once, just making respecing and build creation a lot more easy. But that's all of the main information we have so far for season 3. We are getting a developer live stream on the 18th, and either sometime later on the 18th or the 19th, we're going to be getting full patch notes. So we're going to get a lot more information there. Overall, I'm personally pretty excited for the season. Like I mentioned, if you're somebody that was really excited for leaderboards, you'll probably be a bit more negative on this season so far. I do think a lot of the stuff they've shown I'm pretty interested in. I'm actually pretty excited for there being a super customizable companion that also has different abilities, and that looks really cool. Vaults I'm kind of 50-50 on. They can be really good if done correctly. Being able to juice up these vaults, get a bunch more rewards, have these different hazards you have to play around to even get more loot at the end. That can be a really cool piece of content depending on if they do it correctly. But I can also see a piece of content like that being very annoying to boost up and then having a bunch of your resources wasted because you got hit by some random trap. So I'm 50-50 on that, but overall I'm decently optimistic about this season, but I'm holding off my main thoughts until we get the developer live stream and get more information. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.